In 1891, there was a fight in Millington in which a black man was murdered. His name was Thomas Campbell. An inquest was called for, and they asked the local doctor, James High Hill, to do an autopsy on this murder victim. And he determined that this guy died of a heart attack. And the final results were made in April 1892, and the local black community was incensed because it was pretty clear this Thomas Campbell was murdered, and he was beaten to death actually. And so when that happened, a group of black men and boys attacked the doctor one night, and they beat him to such an extent that he died the next day. Well, that caused a huge furor in Kent County, among the dominant white farmers and white politicals, and as a consequence, there was just this palpable racial tension. They started arresting the suspects in the Hill murder, and newspaper men from all over the nation reported on it, and several came down here from Philadelphia. And it's kind of interesting side note is that one of the guys from Philadelphia actually essentially began to investigate it outside local law enforcement, and actually came up with some of the information that resulted in the charges being filed against 8 men and boys in the Hill murder. But right in the midst of that process, little Nellie Silcox in Kenningtonville was raped, and she, I think the date was May 17th, 1892. She accused a black man named James Taylor, who was a laborer on the farm where she lived. This James Taylor was arrested. He was taken to the jail in Chestertown and lodged in the jail, and soon after, the day after he was lodged in the jail, angry white area residents began gathering at the jail. The sheriff knew that wasn't going to end well, and so that night he took this James Taylor with another one of the prisoners in the jail. In fact, it was one of the Hill murder suspects, and they in the evening went out on a boat and went over to Queen Anne's County for the night. And that morning they brought James Taylor back and put him back in the jail. Well, that next day, the crowd started gathering again. We're talking right here in Chestertown, across the street from the courthouse. There's this big crowd of angry white farmers and locals that wanted justice done right away. In fact, they wanted, if I may, Judge Lynch to take care of this problem and not wait for the regular course of judicial process. That night, the sheriff wanted to take this James Taylor out on the boat again. Turns out the county commissioners would not approve the expenditure for the boat trip. So the sheriff figured he'd hole up in the jail, and he got all his deputies, including a couple of his brothers, the local law enforcement in Chestertown. They locked all the doors, and as soon as it turned dark, the crowds appeared. There was a crowd of roughly 200, 300 angry white men, and there was about 60 of them who were armed with probably pitchforks and shotguns and hammers and whatever else they could get. And they, of course, approached the jail. The jail was locked up, so they went around to the back door, and I think it was a metal door on the back of the jail at that time, and it was locked, of course. And somebody brought up a sledgehammer, and about 6 knocks, boom, boom, boom. You can imagine the sound this was making, and you can imagine the fear of the people inside, whether they were law enforcement or whether they were prisoners. It had to scare the heck out of them. The sheriff deputies said, "Hold back, don't come in. You're not allowed in here." But they wouldn't have any of it, and of course they threatened the deputies, and eventually the deputies moved out of the way so they wouldn't get injured, because there were like 6 or 7 law enforcement when you had 60 masked men with all manner of weaponry. And Taylor was on the second floor in one of the cells up there. And they made their way to the second floor, and they used a rope that was actually in the jail that had been used for a hanging in 1891. They found the rope right there in the jail, and they went to the Taylor's cell, and they used a sledgehammer again to break into the cell because it was locked. And of course he was probably scared to death, and didn't even have his shoes on. They slipped that rope around his neck right there and dragged him out of the jail cell, dragged him downstairs, even fell when they pulled him. They literally had to help him up so that he would continue the walk down the stairs. Now the lynchers had this internal debate about whether or not where they would hang him. They tried to plan this ahead and figure out where they would hang him, and of course they thought about taking him outside the just out in the rural area, out at somebody's farm, and one of the Chestertown officials, and probably one of the commissioners, I think they had 3 commissioners at the time, begged these guys not to lynch this guy in town because it would besmirch the town to have this legacy of a lynching. And but by the time they pulled him out there, the pressure was on by the crowds, because there were crowds outside too, and the crowd of white people said, "Hang him now, hang him now." And so they looked around, they pulled him across the courthouse green, and right there on Cross Street, they crossed the roadway there, and they found a little 10-foot maple tree on Cross Street, between the Rockwell house and the I think it's the Armstrong house maybe. And the tree was so small, you picture them throwing the rope around a branch or something like that, but they didn't do that. They just threw the rope over a branch attached to his neck, but they didn't attach the rope to the branch. They just pulled on the rope multiple times until this guy choked to death. They left the body hanging there about 11 o'clock that night. It was decided to take him down from the tree, and they took him over to the engine house, which is basically where Fountain Park is now. There was a little engine house for their little fire engine, and they left the body there overnight. An inquest followed the next day, and of course the determination of how he died was pretty obvious. It didn't take him long, and they removed his body to the Almshouse Cemetery, which is outside of Chestertown, and they buried his body in an unmarked grave out there. When the lead judge in the Hill murder case gave his spiel at the time of sentencing, and he sentenced all those people to death, eight men and boys he sentenced to death. Part of his spiel, he talked about the lynching, and it was really interesting because he was one of the old timers in Kent County, and his family dated back to the 1600s. They were here, and he said he decried the lack of justice here, the cheating of justice, and he said the same thing that we might say now is, we don't know whether James Taylor did anything. We don't know what he did, but he didn't get his day in court like the Constitution guaranteed him. And this judge talked about the constitutional aspects of how lynchings cheat that. And so bottom line is, James Taylor might have been a terrible guy. We don't know. We'll never know. And that's the problem. Justice was cheated here.